My name is Isabelle Troxler. My topic for this presentation is the She, or the fairies. I will be using stories from Sligo in Northern Ireland to help gather intel on the mischievous behaviors of fairies within their fairy forts, and how it has impacted fairy lore and the belief system within this region of Ireland. With various stories from the school's collection, I'll be discussing the associations of luck and mischief from those having resided in Sligo. As you may know, fairies have been given various names, a few being the good people, the little people, the she. In modern societies, fairies are a universal term to describe a type of mythological folk. Terms as little winged, people who are joyful and help others, animals, and beings. In Western countries, depictions of fairies were shown in movies and television, like Tinkerbell and the other fairies of that series, as you can see here, or Fairytopia, or Winx Club, all recent representations of fairies. As we know, within Ireland, fairy lore is depicted as beings of alternate proportions than westernized fairies, being passed down through an oral transmission of stories and retellings of experiences. As Ireland encompasses the origin story of fairies and how they came to be, sacred areas and ways of fairy life are still told and seen to this day within Ireland and among its locals. I'll be focusing on the fairy forts and the ways mischievous fairies protect their homes from humans. Fairy forts, also known as Dios or Wrath, have a history to themselves, deriving thousands of years ago from the arrival of Tuatha Dé Danann and their inevitable destruction, back to the other world where they now reside in such forts and other sacred areas of Ireland. Even though the fairy faith and belief seem to diminish, the many stories about fairy encounters and experiences prevail in various communities with rich histories of fairy lore. Sligo, a town in Northern Ireland, an area where locals have shared their fairy lore. Both folk stories and the historical recognition of a community like Sligo, there is evidence of religious, cultural, and environmental factors that go into play when discussing fairy lore. Within Northern Ireland, stories of fairy forts and interesting fairy behavior are common in that region. These stories discuss mischievous behaviors causing disabilities, injury, and even death. Not only do fairies become prominent acts of violence towards humans, but also others, like animals. Within each community in Ireland, stories about fairy lore come in mere variations and forms. From the book The Good People, New Fairy Lore, essays by Peter Narvaez, they discuss those common retellings that I'll be discussing later, and discussing how their capacity for harm was well known and feared. They stole food, led people astray, abducted humans and animals, replaced them with changelings, inflicted disabilities, and caused sickness and death. Page 202. In Sligo, stories of fairy mischief were primarily about harm, death, and disabilities. Those residing within the town who have shared their experience with fairy lore vary in age. Reading through the various stories from Sligo, a pattern between fairies and bad luck and injury become apparent. Each story provides a narrative, where when a human went within the fort or bothered the fort structure, there was evidence of harm done as a form of retaliation and protection to their home base. In the first story, Fairy Forts by Mr. Conboy, says, "In my district there's one fairy fort, the name of which fort, Willie Fort. Many years ago the owner cut a little bunch from near the place, and next morning 2 of his cattle were blind. The people that this field belongs to do not plow it, but cattle graze there. In the fort of Durla, a pot of gold is supposed to be hidden and guarded by a black cat. It is believed that was in the forts the fairy believed people always lived. In bygone days lights were seen and music heard, and horsemen were seen leaving the forts at night." In this story, in the owner taking what is considered to be the fairies, consequences were dire for the eyes of the 2 cattle. The mention of other animals guarding the fort after such events puts emphasis on the fairies' shape-shifting abilities and brings more recognition to the fairies' fierce protectivity toward the otherworldly places. In the second story, Fairy Forts by James Henry, he says, "There's a fort that I know in Ross, and it is called Harry's Fort. It is surrounded by earth and trees. There is a cove in it leading underground, and in this cove the people used to hear music and churning, and the old people that were passing would see the little fairies hurling. Other times they would see them riding on ponies, and up to this day no person would cut a bush or break a branch for fear that they might disrupt the fairies or bring bad luck upon their people." This story helps gather the understanding of fairies' reputation. In the author's narration, the words "no person would" state that it is common knowledge to behave in such a way from fear of bad luck. This term bad luck becomes repetitive within the stories, but provides a picture to how deep this rooted fear of fairy mischief really is. In the third story, Fairy Forts by Winnie Healy in Upper Sligo, she says, "John Dwyer's fort, McMurrin's, and the one in the Castle Field. These forts were built in the time of the Firbolg. There are a number of old stories attached to it. It is said that there was a man plowing in the field, and that he went to plow the fort also, but the fort opened up and swallowed the plow and horses. There's an entrance hole to it, and 2 fishing rods would not reach to the end of it. The old people tell us that it's not likely to interfere with the forts, as they belong to the fairies." The mention of older people does bring clarity to those older who keep the narrative of providing respect and space to fairies in hopes of easing the bad luck and negative behaviors fairies possess. In the first story, Fairy Forts by Maura Keeney, she says, "There's another fort at Drum, a townland near Sunny. One moonlight night, a man named Michael Moonahan, who is now dead, was proceeding home by his fort, and as he was crossing a stile, a black man came running out of the fort across in front of him. He fell back with fright, but when he discovered, he thought he heard voices in the fort saying some old rhyme. He went on his journey, but he thought that the man was following him all the time. Around this fort there is a hedge, and this man, who was followed by the black man, was supposed to have cut the bushes. It is supposed to be very unlucky to interfere with fairies seen using shape-shifting tactics to get the man to leave the fort, which is a particular method which doesn't include violence, but is definitely a mischievous tactic that will prevent further visitation from this man." In the fifth story, The Fairies by M. Murray, says, "Most people believe in fairies. Now, those fairies are supposed to live in the old forts. Many people are afraid of the anger of the fairies. There are many old tales about the fairies. When young children do not say as they are told, their mothers threaten to bring them to the fairies. The fairies are very important people in Ireland." This provides a different perspective on the importance of fairy lore in childhood, as well as in popular Irish culture. In the sixth story, Old Forts by Frances McCann, says, "In this townland Carnery, there is a big hill called Dunhill. It is supposed that it was once the headquarters of the fairies of Carnery. The old people say that the fairies have been seen singing and dancing in the big companies around this hill on a bright night. Nobody likes to go near this hill at night because the old people have a good deal of old superstitions about it. There is also another hill in this district called Cunamana Fort. It is also believed by the old people that fairies live there. It is a terrible big fort. Some of the old people of this place say that they saw the fairies in this fort. They also say that no 2 persons could see the fairies. Therefore, no person likes to pass by these old forts late at night." This story provides readers with a sense of mystery because of the inability to determine for sure the sights seen by the older locals of the community. It is based on their word and those of other elderly locals. Then again, stories of fairy sightings have been told in plenty and with many different witnesses. In the 7th story, Fairy Forts by Andrew Mulligan, says, "There is a fairy fort in our school district. Once upon a time, fairies were seen in it, but not now. The fort is situated in the townland of Clonticarn. It is circular in shape. No one ever tried to get a crop of it as it's supposed to be unlucky to take anything from the ferries. There is another fort about 2 miles to the west of Gertine, and stones were taken from it to build a barn. When it was built, however, the supervisor came to look at it, and when he went inside, the walls were covered with blood. On another occasion, a cow was put gazing on the fort, and she pined away until she died. About 4 years ago, a horse was put into it, and after he ate a few mouthfuls of grass, he got sick and died. A more gruesome example of fairy mischief, and in an instance of where the narrator is unsure of fairy faith and lore. Those who are innocent, like the animals in this story, are given bad luck and unfortunately die as a result, but this mischief keeps a stable reputation of fear. In the 8th story, Fairy Forts by James Conway says, "A mile from my house is a large fort in the townland of Troxler, in the parish of Givaf, which is known as Leosglen. It is situated in a large green field and is said to be there from the time of the Danes. It is circular in shape, surrounded by 20 blackthorn trees in a ditch 6 feet high. Fairies are always in and around this fort. It is built on a kind of hilltop, and under this they live. Its bushes are very weather-beaten looking. 6 years ago these fairies attacked an old man. At 12 o'clock this man was coming home from a house near the fort. As he passed by, the fairies came out in all their colors and challenged him to beat him. Then all of those began dancing and jumping around him. It is believed that they beat the man at last, and that he was ill for 6 months later. This was in the month of February, and this time every year since that the man gets ill. Fairies' vengeance becomes activated at signs of humans nearby, even if that human is unaware and in no form behaving in a potentially violent manner towards the fort. This amplifies fairies' mischief and gives reason to elders providing set rules when arriving around fairy forts for younger adults." Fairy Forts by F. Hunt says, "This fort has no rings at all around it, as Anthony Moffat leveled every one of them, but it took him 3 or 4 years to level them. He used the till what he would level every year and set potatoes in it, but it was said that the fairies' bad luck fell upon him, as he broke his leg, and he got it set again. Before it was rightly set, he broke it again. It got all right again, but that the bad luck was not over yet, as he fell off his ass and broke his arm, so that is why it is said that the bad luck of the fairies fell upon him. The fairies are supposed to have some of their treasure down in the caves of this fort." Again, fairies are given bad luck to the man to disrupt their fort, and these painful experiences emphasize the topic of bad luck, injury, and disability, all within this one man. In the last story, Fairy Forts by Mare Supal says, "Some time ago the owner of this fort opened one side of it to take out sand. It is said he had no luck from that time forward. There are many strange things supposed to have been seen and heard about it. Several times there was a strange music heard and lights seen at it. One day a man in this district went to it to bring out sand with a horse and cart. When he had the cart filled, the horse would not draw it out. No amount of persuasion or thrust would induce the animal to move, and the cart had to be unloaded again. Another time, a lorry came to it for sand, and when it was ready to move out, the engine would not work. The driver, when trying to start it, twisted his hand and got his wrist broken. From that time, the place was regarded as unlucky, and nobody would have anything to do with it." What becomes evident is that fairies are willing to protect forts from anyone, not solely humans, and in that fact gives an added sense of danger to their mischief, in the way that those innocent of bad harbored thoughts towards the fairies or forts are still seen as a threat. There seems to be either a true belief of fairy lore or subtle speculations of its possibilities within this community. Terms like "it is said," or "there once was," or "those who still believe say," are used in the stories of those who are skeptical of the fairy faith but still hold the local Irish importance within their culture and traditions. What is clear is those who are older, within the baby boom generation and up, have had face-to-face experiences with fairies and lore, maybe from being wise in years and the ability to catch on to other worldly beings and behaviors, or perhaps the many years within their community, passing by fairy forts and chatting with other locals who have news to share of such lore. The time spent within a community, with visible, tangible, and natural spaces where lore is able to stay relevant in everyday life and conversations, limits the possibility of its elimination as long as those respect them. Considering the consistency of fairy forts as sacred and not to be disrupted or even touched continues the narrative of fairy lore and its association with harm and bad luck. The other world and those around that, other than humans, provide solace for fairies. As the other world has been represented as a dark and dangerous force to be feared, fairies have acquired a similar reputation. What is mysterious and unable to understand gives those unlike them to perceive them as a threat. Fairy mischief in Sligo prevails in 1, keeping humans afraid and respectful of fairy forts, and 2, continuing fairy lore as those who have seen fairy mischief and those who have had not may still behave and discuss the possibilities of fairies within their community. This community is rich in cultural beliefs, through oral transmission from folk tales and stories as we see here in all those stories. Even those that are unable to experience a full picture of fairy lore take away certain aspects of the stories, be it childhood stories, parent-child interactions, connections to nature, community, and family. It provides the locals with a sense of community and self, and protects and preserves Irish lore and environment for the next generation.